The sun was merciless that Thursday, October 15th, 1987. In a modest conference room in Ouagadougou, a man with fire in his eyes and revolution in his heart stood before a table of trusted aides. His name was Thomas Sankara, the youngest president in Africa, a man who had dared to dream that a continent could stand on its own feet, that a people once broken by chains could rise and walk upright again, that leaders didn't have to steal, kneel, or lie. But that day, revolution bled. At exactly 4:30 p.m., boots slammed against concrete. The doors burst open. A commando unit, once sworn to protect Sankara, now raised their guns at him. Eyewitnesses say Sankara stood tall, unarmed, calm. "Hold on, I am the one they are mad with," he said, surrendering himself to the storm. 12 bullets tore through him, then more for his aides. Only one man lived, by pretending to be dead among his brothers. The betrayal was surgical, planned, cold, and worse still, it was orchestrated by Bled, his closest friend, the man Sankara once called brother. But you can't kill an idea. You can't bury a dream that refuses to die. That's when a ghost was born. Not a ghost of fear, but of resistance. And somewhere in the ashes of that betrayal, a boy named Ibrahim Traoré would grow up hearing whispers of that ghost. One day he would answer it. They didn't just kill him, they tried to erase him. After Thomas Sankara's assassination, there was no state funeral, no parade of mourners, no national moment of silence. His body was hacked apart, stripped of dignity, and dumped into an unmarked grave like trash swept under history's carpet. His death certificate, signed with cold indifference, read, "Natural causes." They wrote lies over his blood. His wife, Miriam, with her 2 sons, fled the country in silence, haunted, hunted, alone. And Bled, he moved into the palace that Sankara had refused to renovate, where the fan never blew cool air because Sankara refused to live in luxury while his people slept in heat. Comrade reversed the revolution overnight. He welcomed back the IMF, reopened the doors to neo-colonial influence, and rewrote the country's memory. But Sankara's revolution refused to rest. In the back streets of Ouagadougou, old women whispered his name. In dusty classrooms, barefoot children studied with chalk stolen from shuttered schools, still believing in his literacy dream. In hidden radio broadcasts, rebels quoted him like scripture. "You can kill a revolutionary, but you cannot kill a revolution." And far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, a silent army was awakening. In Mali, Niger, Congo, young men heard the story. They heard about the president who made ministers ride bicycles, about the soldier who gave his people land, dignity, and truth. They heard, and they waited. Among them was a boy from Bondokui, quiet, watchful. He read Sankara's speeches by moonlight. He vowed he'd finish what they started. His name? Ibrahim Traoré. He was not born into power, not even into comfort. Ibrahim Traoré came from Bondokui, a place where goats outnumbered textbooks and water was drawn more often than dreams. He walked barefoot across cracked earth to attend school, listening to the stories his elders told at night. The stories of a man who renamed a country, who defied France, who planted forests with his own hands. A man who was murdered because he loved his people too much. That man was Thomas Sankara. At first, the stories sounded like myths, too pure, too defiant, too dangerous. But then Ibrahim found the speeches. He read the words, memorized them, devoured them. He who feeds you, controls you. We must dare to invent the future. He didn't just understand the fire, he swallowed it. At 20, Traoré joined the military, not for power, but to serve. But the army was no sanctuary. It had long been a tool of elites, a mercenary arm of the corrupt. He saw soldiers fight without cause, bleed without meaning. He saw how power had grown soft in the belly and hard in the heart, but he never lost the dream. Quietly, Ibrahim gathered like minds. Young officers, disillusioned by foreign-controlled agendas, and a government that cowered before terror instead of confronting it. They spoke in whispers at first, then in meetings, then in plans. Beneath the surface of Burkina Faso, something began to stir again. Not just a coup, a second revolution. And once more, the ghost of Sankara walked the halls of power, wearing a new face, speaking with a new voice, and that voice was about to roar. On September 30th, 2022, the silence finally broke. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely 34 years old, appeared on national television wearing the unmistakable red beret of the Burkina Faso military. Behind him, a line of steely-eyed soldiers. In front of him, chaos. The country had collapsed into violence and fear. Terrorist attacks had swallowed villages. The government had surrendered to shadows. The people were starving, begging, forgotten. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. Traoré declared that the sitting junta had failed, that Burkina Faso deserved better, that it was time for the revolution to return, not just in name, but in spirit. And in that moment, with one announcement, he became the most loved and the most hunted man in West Africa. Across Ouagadougou, people poured into the streets, not with fear, but with fists raised high. Chants of Sankara lives echoed through the capital. Red berets became more than fabric. They became flags. They became shields. But while the people rejoiced, his enemies took note. Within hours, the plotting began. Not one, not two, but 18 known attempts would follow. Some with guns, some with poison, some with treachery. One attempt offered a suitcase of $5 million to the soldier closest to him. A trigger pull away from erasing the revolution once again. The soldier refused. Because this wasn't about money, it was about meaning. Traoré had become a living symbol, and the most dangerous kind. A young, fearless African who would not bow to France, to corporations, or to cowardice. He wore Sankara's shadow like a second skin, and that made him a target the world couldn't ignore. The first attempt came just days after Traoré took power. A sniper, trained in a foreign camp, embedded in the capital. He fired from the roof of an abandoned radio tower, missed by inches. The bullet shattered concrete near Traoré's convoy. He didn't flinch. The second attempt came from within, a trusted officer. A glass of wine laced with a toxin so rare it wouldn't show on autopsies. But Traoré drank water that night. The third was a bomb, planted beneath the floor of a community center where Traoré was scheduled to speak. Hundreds would have died. A child playing outside the building found the wires. He was too young to know what it was, but old enough to report it. Each time he dodged death, the myth grew. 18 attempts, that we know of. Some say the Americans warned him. Some say the French were involved. Others whisper of mercenaries hired by exiled oligarchs and bitter generals. The kind of men who never forgive a young soldier for saying no to their gold. But Traoré wasn't chasing power. He was haunted by something older than politics. A ghost, a promise, a corpse dumped in an unmarked grave. And somehow, every time they came for him, he survived. Burkina Faso elders began calling him the man who walks through fire. Women lit candles in their windows. Youths wrote poems in his name. The world saw a leader, but the enemies saw something worse. They saw hope, and hope for those who profit from chaos is the most dangerous thing of all. It started with a whisper, then it became a chant, then it became a thunderclap. Sankara lives, echoed through Ouagadougou like a war cry resurrected from the grave. Young men painted his face on walls, his quotes on their chests. Women carried photos of him in cloth wraps, like saints carried in shrines. School children stood in courtyards and recited his speeches like sacred verses. Something was waking, something that refused to die. Traoré had not declared himself a savior. He hadn't promised paradise. But the people saw Sankara in him, in his simplicity, his steel eyes, his unshakable voice, and in his refusal to kneel. The streets of Burkina Faso transformed. Red berets sold out across markets. Poems, murals, and revolutionary songs filled the air. The people were no longer spectators. They were soldiers again. And as if the spirit of 1983 had burst through time, entire neighborhoods began organizing food drives, rebuilding schools, and clearing roads, without government orders. Just like Sankara taught them, Traoré hadn't just stepped into power, he had stepped into a phantom revolution that never truly ended. But the international watchers saw it too. And that's when the threats escalated. That's when satellites started tracking his every move. That's when certain visitors arrived quietly in Ouagadougou, offering aid with smiles and questions with knives behind their backs. Eyes fixed on the ground where Thomas Sankara was shot. The crowd was silent. Men wept. Women raised portraits. Children, not even born when Sankara died, stood on their toes just to witness history heal itself. The Thomas Sankara Mausoleum was unveiled, not as a tombstone, but as a rebirth. Designed by world-renowned architect Francis Carré, the structure wasn't built with steel and ego. It was shaped from earth and laterite stone, drawn from the villages Sankara loved. Local villagers carried clay with bare hands. Families built with sweat and memory. This wasn't just a monument. It was forgiveness. It was fire. Inside, 13 tombs lie in a glowing ring, each under a beam of sunlight that dances across the room as the sun moves. It's not random, it's rhythm, a silent ceremony of light, as if the heavens still kneel before the men they stole. The very building where Sankara and his aides were killed now sits in the heart of the memorial, encircled by water, unreachable, sacred. Traoré didn't speak much that day. He just whispered at the tomb. They couldn't bury you deep enough. The mausoleum wasn't just for Burkina Faso. It was for every African child told to be silent, every woman told to obey, every rebel told to kneel. And standing tall above it all will soon rise an 87-meter tower, 1 meter for every year since Sankara's death. A tower shaped like hope, because the revolution didn't die. It was waiting for someone to finish the story. It hasn't risen yet, but its shadow already stretches across the nation. They call it La Tour 87, the 87-meter tower that will rise above the blood-soaked ground where Thomas Sankara fell. Each meter marks a year since that fateful coup in 1987. But this isn't just architecture. It's a vertical rebellion, one that scrapes the sky and dares the world to look up. The design is audacious. A restaurant at the top shaped like the very outline of Burkina Faso. A spiraling ramp that lifts you from the soil to the stars. A funicular that ensures even the old and frail can ascend to the peak. From its summit, you'll see all of Ouagadougou, the palaces, the markets, the graveyards, the neighborhoods once burned by poverty now rising with murals of Sankara and Traoré side by side. But the foundation, that's what matters most, because this tower stands over the exact site where betrayal struck, where bullets ended a presidency but failed to kill a purpose, where traitors danced in celebration while the world turned away. This is a stake through the heart of forgetting, and it is being built not by foreign contractors in suits, but by local workers, masons, and artists who carry Sankara's legacy in their bones. The bricks are touched by hands that still remember the day the revolution died, and the day it began to rise again. It will not be a tower of luxury, it will be a lighthouse for a continent in storm, a symbol that says, we are still here, we are still rising, and this time, we will not bow. They laughed together. They plotted revolution together. They took oaths under starlight, vowing to free their people or die trying. Thomas Sankara and Blaise Compaoré were more than soldiers. They were brothers, and then one brother pulled the trigger. Bled didn't shoot the gun. No, he hired the men who did. And the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was apocalyptic. Sankara had given Compaoré everything: power, trust, the title of second in command. He'd even protected him against critics inside the revolution. But Blaise wanted more, and foreign powers were watching. When Sankara started targeting corruption in Pan-African institutions, when he dared to call out France and challenge debt slavery, when he demanded Africa feed itself and kick out the IMF, they knew he had to go. And Blaise? He was willing. He ruled for 27 years after Sankara's death, backed by the very international forces Sankara warned about. He restored foreign aid. He rolled out the red carpet to neo-colonial masters. He destroyed revolutionary courts and silenced dissent. He even buried Sankara's name. But something clung to him, a shadow, a sickness, the curse of betrayal. His people never forgave him. Whispers grew louder, protests swelled, and in 2014, they burned his statues and stormed his palace. Compaoré fled in shame, exiled, despised, stripped of power. Then came justice. In 2022, a military tribunal sentenced him to life in prison, in absentia. But even behind walls, his legacy poisons the air. Because the tragedy of Africa isn't just foreign interference. It's when a comrade chooses comfort over country, power over people, bullet over brotherhood. And the ghost of that betrayal? It still roams the corridors of Burkina Faso, warning every leader that the people remember. He didn't ride in limousines. He rode a bicycle. While other African leaders cruised in motorcades and Mercedes-Benz convoys, Thomas Sankara pedaled through Ouagadougou on a battered two-wheeler, dust in his eyes and revolution in his chest. He sold off the government's fleet of Mercedes, made the Renault 5 the cheapest car in the country, the official state vehicle. He slashed his own salary to $450 a month, owned 4 bikes, 3 guitars, and a broken freezer. No chauffeur, no red carpet, no first-class flights. Because he believed leadership wasn't luxury, it was service. He banned portraits of himself in offices, said, "There are 7 million Thomas Sankaras." But it wasn't just symbolic. He rolled up his sleeves and planted trees with his hands, led road construction teams in the hot sun, participated in village cleanups. Sankara didn't just talk about equality, he lived it. His government launched a literacy revolution, boosting rates from 13% to 73% in 4 years. He vaccinated 2.5 million children against deadly diseases. He outlawed female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy. He gave land back to farmers, and Burkina Faso became food self-sufficient. For the first time in its history, he turned ministers into public servants, made civil servants wear traditional cotton tunics, woven by local craftspeople to support the national industry. He demanded dignity, not donations, and that terrified the world. Because if one man could live like this and thrive, what excuse did every other president have? They called him Africa's Che Guevara. But he was something more terrifying than a revolutionary. He was a living example that Africa didn't need the West. And so, they killed him. He didn't know the man holding the briefcase. Not at first. The visitor had no military uniform, no accent to place, no sweat on his brow despite the heat of Ouagadougou. He smiled too easily, spoke too politely, said he represented friends, said he had an opportunity for Ibrahim Traoré. Then he opened the case. $5 million, cash, clean, untraceable. All the young soldier had to do was look away, or better yet, pull the trigger. Make it look like an accident, the man whispered, or don't. Either way, Burkina Faso will thank you. Because the ghost of Thomas Sankara didn't just rise in Traoré's speeches or in his refusal to bow to France. It rose in his policy, his independence, his refusal to kneel before the IMF or trade national dignity for international loans. Just like Sankara. And they couldn't afford another Sankara. But Traoré never touched the money. He stood up, looked the man dead in the eye and said, "There's not enough blood money in the world to silence what's already awake." That man never left the country. He was intercepted, quietly, but the briefcase still locked, still untouched, still burning with the stench of betrayal. And so the world took off the gloves. Assassination attempt after attempt followed. Snipers, poison, staged mutinies, even drone surveillance flown in from foreign bases. But every time death came for him, Traoré didn't run. Because a man who walks with ghosts fears no bullets. And once again, a leader of Burkina Faso chose danger over obedience. This time, they'd have to kill an entire generation to stop the revolution. There is a sound more terrifying than gunfire in a stolen land. Silence. The silence of villages abandoned after terror attacks. The silence of parents who can't feed their children. The silence of governments who smile on TV while their people die in the shadows. When Ibrahim Traoré seized power, he wasn't just fighting corruption or foreign control, he was waging war on silence. Entire regions of Burkina Faso had become ghost zones. Over 2 million people displaced by terrorist groups, schools shuttered, hospitals abandoned, roads choked with fear. The previous leadership had surrendered quietly, pleaded with the West for help, traded sovereignty for speeches and summit invites. But Traoré did something dangerous. He spoke, loudly, defiantly. He called out international hypocrisy, pointing to nations that funded both aid and arms. He rejected Western partnerships that came with chains. He told the United Nations what others only dared whisper: "You bring us aid after bleeding us dry. What we need is not help, it's freedom." Then he turned inward. He mobilized the youth, armed volunteers, launched recruitment drives not just for soldiers, but for citizens. Because he knew the war wouldn't be won with weapons alone. It needed willpower, purpose, unity. Traoré flooded the airwaves, speaking directly to the people. No prepared statements, no diplomatic jargon, just the truth. Raw and unsettling, and the people responded. Mothers sent sons to join the fight. Farmers brought food to feed battalions. Elders performed blessings on street corners, calling on the ancestors to protect him. They no longer saw him as just a president. They saw him as their voice, a voice loud enough to shake palaces in Paris, a voice brave enough to shout what Sankara had once whispered, a voice that reminded the world, Africa is not asleep. It was silenced. Not anymore. She wasn't a soldier. She had no rank, no rifle, but she was the first to arrive at the protest and the last to leave. In the alleys of Bobo Dioulasso and the markets of Ouagadougou, women whispered to each other again. Not in fear, but in fire, because they remembered something. They remembered a man who once said, "The revolution and women's liberation go hand in hand." That man was Thomas Sankara, and he didn't just speak of women's rights, he rewrote the script. He criminalized forced marriage. He outlawed female genital mutilation. He told husbands to wash their own clothes and hold their own babies. He appointed women to cabinet positions. He recruited them into the army, not to cook, but to command. Under Sankara, women weren't flowers, they were flames. And now under Ibrahim Traoré, the fire is rising again. He didn't inherit his vision from a Western manual on gender inclusion. He inherited it from Burkina Faso women who raised him, fed him, taught him strength through struggle. Today, women are leading neighborhood defense groups. Women are organizing literacy drives and food distributions. Women are front and center, not in the shadows. And Traoré sees it. He's reinstating programs for maternal care, promoting female commanders. He's putting women on the front lines, not because they're women, but because they've always been warriors. And here's the secret his enemies don't understand. This revolution has a mother's memory. It remembers the hunger, the silence, the betrayal, and when women rise, not with guns, but with truth and steel in their eyes, nothing can stop a nation. Because the revolution, this time, wears a woman's face. There was a time when Burkina Faso's land was cracked, dry, and cursed. They said it would never grow again, that the Sahel was doomed, that the desert was winning. But then came a man with calloused hands and a rusted hoe. Thomas Sankara didn't wait for UN climate resolutions or billion-dollar conferences. He rolled up his sleeves and planted trees, 10 million of them, with soldiers, students, farmers. Entire villages dug trenches, sowed seeds, and shaded the earth. He said, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness." That madness became green. Wheat yields more than doubled. Burkina Faso, for the first time, fed itself without foreign grain. Villages once plagued by famine began harvesting abundance. The soil became sacred again. But after his assassination, the desert crept back in. His policies uprooted, his forests neglected. Land that once bloomed with revolution turned to dust again, until now. Ibrahim Traoré has returned to the land, not as a savior, but as a son of it. He's revived tree planting campaigns, promoted agroecology, empowered local farmers to take ownership of food production, but more importantly, he's teaching the next generation that the soil is not dead, it's sleeping. And when a people plant something with love, not debt, not bribes, but love, the land remembers. In one village, an elder pointed to a sprouting acacia and said, "Sankara planted this when I was a boy. Traoré watered it when I was old. My grandson will climb it when we are free." Because revolutions aren't just written in history books. Sometimes they grow from the ground. It began with a hammer blow. A boy, barefoot, no older than 10, stood on his brother's shoulders in the heart of Ouagadougou. In his hand, a stone. He hurled it at a statue of Bled Compaoré, the man who murdered Sankara and ruled for nearly 3 decades like a foreign puppet in an African uniform. The stone cracked bronze. Then another flew, and another, until the statue bled dust and humiliation. That day, Burkina Faso shattered silence with fists. It was October 2014. The people, tired of lies, of stolen futures, of masked neocolonialism, rose up and burned the regime to the ground. The parliament building was engulfed in flames. Statues were ripped from their pedestals. Giant posters of Compaoré were stomped into ash. What had held for 27 years collapsed in 27 hours. But it wasn't just about a man. It was about what he represented. The betrayal of Sankara. The selling of land and soul to foreign interests. The burial of dreams beneath corruption and concrete. And when Compaoré fled in a helicopter, leaving behind luxury suits and blood-stained office chairs, the people didn't just cheer. They cried. Because this wasn't just victory, it was resurrection. That was the day they dug up Sankara's ghost from the red soil of the unmarked grave and promised him they'd never be silent again. Now, with Traoré, that same energy is back, but not in fire and rage. This time, it's in planning, building, teaching. But the memory remains. Statues don't bleed unless they were built on betrayal. And in Burkina Faso, truth always finds a way to tear them down. There's a silence colder than betrayal. The silence of France when Sankara was gunned down in 1987. No condemnation, no investigation, no outrage. Only shrugs, meetings behind closed doors, and a sudden warming of ties with Bled Compaoré, the man who pulled the strings, the man who opened the gates again to French influence, to World Bank loans, to IMF chains. Thomas Sankara had stood on French soil and looked President François Mitterrand in the eye. He said, "You receive apartheid leaders in your salons. How dare you lecture Africa on human rights?" The room froze. Cameras rolled. And Sankara, barehanded, broke, unafraid, spoke truth to empire. That day, Paris made a decision. He had to go. Since his death, French officials have deflected every request for transparency. Decades passed before they declassified a single document related to the coup. Even then, the most critical files remain sealed. Why? What did France know? What did they approve? In silence, power hides. But now, under Ibrahim Traoré, the silence is being broken. He has expelled French troops from Burkina Faso, closed French military bases, reclaimed airspace once controlled by advisors. He's spoken at rallies with Sankara's picture behind him and told the youth, "No more foreign boots on our soil unless they answer to us." To some in the West, this is dangerous nationalism. To Burkina Faso citizens, it's finally justice. The same wind that once carried Sankara's speeches through megaphones now lifts Traoré's voice. And it's being heard not just in Burkina Faso, but across Mali, Niger, Guinea. Because this isn't about hate, it's about freedom. And the age of France's quiet rule over African nations is ending. They say each revolution has a number. For Burkina Faso, that number is 87 meters, the exact planned height of the new tower rising from the ground where Sankara fell. 87 bullets in the soil by some accounts. 87 wounds in the soul of a nation that refused to forget. But more than that, 1987 is the year they tried to end the story. Instead, it became the prologue. Now, as the construction cranes rise into the sky and scaffolds snake up toward the clouds, children stand at the edge of the site and count 83, 84, 85. Each step of that tower is a defiance. The 87th step will lead to a skywalk, shaped like the borders of Burkina Faso, a restaurant in the clouds, a library with Sankara's writings engraved in stone, a viewing deck that stretches high above the capital and whispers to every visitor. This is how far truth can rise. But the tower is more than metal and concrete. It's built on dreams that refuse to stay buried. It's built on every villager who carried a brick, every artist who painted Sankara's face on a wall, every young soldier who chose to protect the people instead of power. And at its foundation is a promise that no one, not even death, can erase a legacy born of integrity, justice, and sacrifice. When completed, it will be visible from the sky, a beacon, a warning, a prayer. And when the 87th step is finally climbed, and a child looks out over the capital and asks, "Who was Thomas Sankara?" the answer won't come from a book. It will come from the wind, because some voices never die. There are 18 shadows that follow Ibrahim Traoré, not metaphors, assassination attempts. Each one real, each one silent until it wasn't. Each one a bullet, a poison, a plan meant to end not just his life, but the return of a revolution they failed to bury. The first came within days of his rise to power, a sniper's scope from an abandoned rooftop. The second, a slow toxin slipped into tea by a trusted hand. Then came mutinies planted in the barracks, rogue drones hovering too long over his convoys, foreign briefcases packed with cash and treason. 18. That's what we know. And yet, every time, he walks out alive. Some say luck, some say military genius, but those closest to him speak in softer tones. They say it's Sankara, that the spirit of a man left unburied now guards the son who dares to finish his story. Traoré doesn't wear bulletproof vests. He doesn't flinch during public speeches. He doesn't hide. He knows the danger. But he also knows this: if they kill me today, another will rise tomorrow, because they don't fear me, they fear what I represent. He's not trying to be immortal. He's trying to make Burkina Faso believe in itself again. And the louder that belief grows, the more dangerous he becomes. Because you can shoot a man, but you can't shoot an awakening. And in every shadow meant to end him, 1,000 more stand in his place, watching, learning, waiting. They thought they buried him, but they forgot something. You cannot bury someone who planted themselves in the hearts of millions. Thomas Sankara is everywhere now, in graffiti on crumbling walls, in the hymns of school children who never met him, in the trembling voice of a farmer who still remembers the day Sankara gave him land and dignity. But more than anything, he lives in memory. And this time, memory is armed with video, with poetry, with documentaries, marches, murals, hashtags. Armed with youth who know his story not as folklore, but as blueprint. Armed with leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who carry his words like scripture. This generation is different. They are not just inspired by Sankara, they are becoming him. Across Africa, flags of Mali, Guinea, and Niger fly beside Burkina Faso's, not just out of solidarity, but out of shared fire. Young soldiers quote Sankara in military briefings. Students name clubs after him. Mothers name their sons Thomas. And for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso has leadership that listens, not to Paris, but to Ouagadougou, not to foreign investors, but to hungry villagers. This is not nostalgia. This is rebirth. Traoré has revived the literacy campaigns, planted new forests, strengthened village militias, elevated women to power, expelled occupiers without war. He is not trying to be Sankara. He is proving Sankara was never gone. Because revolutions don't age. They echo, they sharpen, they wait. And this time, Sankara isn't walking alone. He walks in the voices, hearts, fists, and future of a continent refusing to forget. In 1987, Thomas Sankara stood before his people and said, "While revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas." He was right. They tried with bullets, with silence, with lies. They murdered him, buried him, erased his name from the records. But today, his face is etched in monuments, his words in classrooms, and his legacy in the blood of a new revolution. Ibrahim Traoré is not a saint. He bleeds, he weeps, he has enemies in every direction, but he refuses to kneel. Because the future Sankara died for, a sovereign Africa, proud and self-reliant, is not a dream anymore. It is happening, brick by brick, tree by tree, school by school, speech by speech. And now it's not just one leader, it's a generation. Young Africans refusing to surrender their lands, their voices, their truth. A new chapter is being written in the soil of Burkina Faso, one where children don't fear hunger, where women don't fear silence, where leaders walk among the people, not above them. But this story isn't finished, and now, you are part of it. If this story stirred something inside you, don't scroll past. Comment, what would you ask Sankara if he were alive today? Share this story with someone who needs to know the truth. Subscribe for more untold African